I don't know if you've ever read Ezekiel. It's a crazy book. I mean, this is the mild stuff, bringing bones back to life. And we often think in terms of this as being an immediate sort of antecedent or foreshadowing of the resurrection, of the physical resurrection. But as you can see, that's not what this is really about. This is really about Israel, about feeling dead, about being in exile after the Babylonian have overtaken, and now they're in exile. So this is about new life, in inspired new life in a people, as much as it's about anything. But if you read some of the rest of this, you see sort of a John the Baptist kind of character. Ezekiel is a nut. He sees weird stuff. He's a classic case for the state hospital. This would be somebody when I used to work in the state hospital in Austin, and I was a caseworker there years ago before it was opened up and shut. Well, actually, it was shut down. But for years, these were the kind of people that were being brought in. And seeing the wheel within the wheel. If you go back and you read some of these chapters, you don't want your kids reading them, because there's stuff in there that would probably be R-rated, if not NC-17. Particularly if you go in and try to, and then understand exactly what they're saying. Because in Hebrew it means one thing, and in English it translates rather nicely to mean possibly something benign, but it's not benign at all. This is a tough book. This is a book that is all about the nitty-gritty. It's a book about real life, about the ugly, about the dirty, about the troubled, about the confused, about the addictions. This is a real book about the hardships of life. And Ezekiel, as a prophet, is a nut, and he prophesies in the midst of all of this chaos. The prayer, the St. Francis prayer at this today is this idea of where there is despair, make me an instrument of your hope. Help me to sow hope. So I started thinking about just what despair is. We still don't even keep it. Just let it go. Let it go, Austin. It's okay. It's all right. We'll figure it out afterwards. So I look up despair, and despair is what you would think it is. When you look at the root word, this one's pretty cut and dry. Root word is no hope. That's despair. But I think about how we use the word despair all the time. We use it casually, and then we can think of some pretty bleak situations. We use it casually. We say, my situation is desperate. This week was kind of a desperate week for me. I was out of town for 3 days at a workshop, came back. My mother was in the hospital in the emergency room. There was all sorts of problems. There was bleeding. There was all sorts of ups and downs, low blood pressure, emergency surgery. I had another couple of meetings on Thursday, back and forth to the hospital, had to get the bulletin together at the last minute while we were driving back. So Brad and I are working on this thing en route, back and forth. Mary Ann's working on it because she has to leave town. A lot of chaos. And then, of course, my wife and I are both doing 2 separate weddings over the weekend. And it's her birthday. My mom has another surgery, so I have to leave the wedding rehearsal and rush to the hospital for that surgery. And then we do both weddings on Saturday, and then the one's in the afternoon, one's later in the evening, and then we're gathering with some friends at that wedding in the evening. And then at 10 o'clock, I'm looking down at the text going, what am I going to talk about? And I could say that was a desperate moment. We talk about desperate situations, job deadlines, family situations, but then there's real despair. Then there's real despair. A friend of mine whose child is autistic, severely autistic. Her husband, she's a teacher. Husband left her 2 years after the child's birth. Bad scenario. There and now she's raising this child. She's dealing with the life's reality. I think of people I know who are dealing with their spouses who are in the midst of Alzheimer's. I think of so many stories that I hear about people struggling with children who are dealing with other issues. I mean, there's a lot of despair in the world that we sometimes are distanced from, and the closest we get to is maybe we have a friend or maybe even a relative, but then we say to ourselves, we just kind of cringe internally, and at the same time that we're feeling sympathy, we have this distance. If we're honest with ourselves, we have this distance sort of reality which says, there but for the grace of God go I, and I just hope that doesn't happen to us. Which is somewhat of a mask, isn't it? It's somewhat of a denial in a lot of ways. So then I think of hope. Well, what is hope? Hope in response to despair. Hope, we always think of hope as the sort of the, and I don't want to be too cliche about it, but the sort of standard preacher response is God is always with us. God never leaves us. God is by our side. We can always put our hope in God. And then we just kind of keep saying that, right? We just kind of keep reiterating that. And then the resurrection is a symbol of that hope. And so, amen and good luck. I mean, that's kind of bleak, I realize that, but that's kind of what I grew up with. That's my seminary training. I was trained to be that kind of pastor. But I don't buy that. That's not the final say. That's the mask. The problem is if we identify too much with the mask, we never get to what's behind that. We never get to what we're really called to be. How do we really offer hope in the midst of despair? Now, I don't know if you have mantras. I have a couple of mantras that I use. But one of my favorite mantras are mantrists. Would that be the word? Mantraists. Some of you will remember it. Some of you are not old enough to, but most of you will remember this. Who remembers Stuart Smiley? Do you remember Stuart Smiley? With his or Jack Handy had the happy thoughts, I guess. But Stuart Smiley, he is famous for the I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me, right? How many have actually used that mantra? If you're honest, thank you, yes. I mean, I have, certainly. You know, I've actually walked out of a meeting and gone, okay, that completely sucked, that didn't work at all, but doggone it, people still like me. You know, I've actually used that. Some of my favorite, because I've grown up with alcoholics in my family, and we've been through Al-Anon, and we've been through, some of my other family been through Alcoholics Anonymous, so we got That's Just Stinkin' Thinkin'. That's one of my ones that I often remember. One that I think Charles may have used in here was you're shoulding on everyone. Right? You're shoulding on everyone. Okay, nobody's offended. Okay, good. I love this one that he said, trace it, face it, erase it. Trace it, face it, erase it. You're only as sick as your secrets. Well, that's true. Compare and despair. And then you need to check up from the neck up. Here's a good one. Pee Wee Herman, there but for the grace of God go I. Or this is actually my very favorite. It's easier to put on slippers, because this is really where I'm going. It's easier to put on slippers than to carpet the whole world. There's something to think about there. But here's what I'm thinking about when I read this and I think about what hope is. Because if you look up the root words of hope, the root words of hope mean to leap forward. It means to leap forward. It means to hop. It means to take a leap. And that, to me, is probably the hardest thing in the midst of despair. So whenever I find myself in situations where there is despair or where I'm in despair, I try to keep these two phrases in a dance. As you've kind of gotten the sense from what I talk about in here most Sundays, I think of what it means to be in the kingdom of God, to be present in this reality that we call God's kingdom, is to be participative, is to participate, is to be active. I've often said in here when we've done the rhythmic things, it's not about me. It's about the community. It's about the kingdom. It's about the kingdom. It's about connections. It's not about me. Hard to get around that. Because in the midst of despair, the first thing that comes up is my pain. If we're in the midst of despair, it's my pain. And you certainly don't want to go to someone and say, well, you don't deserve to be thinking about your pain right now, if they're in the midst of that too. So I try to keep a delicate balance between this idea of how to respond to this. What can I do for myself? Where can I do that for myself, and where can I do that for others? And that's what I want you to hang on to as I share a couple of thoughts with you. Where can I do that for myself? Where can I do that for others? And it's a constant dance back and forth. I was speaking with a couple of folks that came in, and I said, this is my message, despair. And immediately scenes came up. Immediately stories came up. You're thinking of people you know right now. You're thinking of your own life right now. You're thinking of conflicts you've heard of. You're thinking of the global scenario. There's so much different aspects of despair, so many different degrees. And our first response is, again, there but for the grace of God go I. But for me, the dance is, What can I do for that? Where can I do something for that problem? Sometimes I'm in the midst of it. Where can I do it for myself means that I'm going to have to look to someone else because it's hard to see the light in the midst of the dark. This scene that we saw from Life is Beautiful, he does something in this story that is really hard to do, but is a profound practice. He reframes the reality. I showed this to my wife, and Linda said, so you're going to basically tell the congregation to just lie. Well, I think we do that often anyway. So, no, I'm not saying lie. I'm saying reframe the reality. I'm saying find the greater truth. He literally reframes the reality for them. The German comes in and is telling everyone that they will be killed. They'll be shot in the back of the head. And he says, you're going to wear jackass on the back of your shoulders if you start to lose points. And if you've watched the movie, I mean, the spoiler alert in the movie, the tank is the prize, right? And, well, I shouldn't spoil it. You need to go watch this movie. It's a great movie if you haven't seen it. It'll tug at your hearts, but it's a profound statement on how to reframe things. This is the month in which we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of Anne Frank's life and her death. You all know who Anne Frank is, the teenager who was in captivity, who hid for a number of years until taken prisoner during the Nazi rule. But then she was executed sometime in March. I'm not sure exactly when, but 70 years ago. And it occurred to me as I was reading some of her diary, which has such positive affirmations about the world around her in spite of her circumstance. And I was thinking, she wasn't sitting there writing this for anyone in particular. She wasn't thinking, you know what, somebody's going to come and collect this, and they're going to publish this, and this is going to be a great message for the world. She wasn't thinking, I'll put my positive statements on Facebook, and everybody will see it. She wasn't thinking any of that. She was expressing her optimism in spite of the reality around her. Bertolini's character had that belief in hope and that belief in the possibility of an optimistic view. He simply reframed reality so that he could try to teach others to see that too. Anne Frank's character simply believed it and just chose to see it in spite of the reality. Anyone hear the This American Life yesterday? Did anybody get to listen to that? Powerful, powerful story. If you get a chance, get back online, look it up in the archives, listen to yesterday's report. It was really both moving and deeply, deeply troubling. If you're a teacher, if you've been a teacher, you'll know just how profoundly challenging listening to this story was. This girl who was just a brilliant student in a school in the Bronx, in an urban setting, deep in the Bronx, the teachers immediately knew that she was an amazing student, and they were pushing her forward to just make everything work for her. But she grew up in poverty. She grew up with negative narratives. She grew up with these sort of typical narratives that have been ingrained, not just ingrained by her own family, ingrained by the culture around her. And she was fighting that narrative in spite of her abilities. But they had the chance, they chose a few of the students, and they would take these students to the nearby private school. And the private school allowed for one person to be chosen out of a select group to win a full scholarship. And then they would move them on into college. And this was her hope. And she looked around her and she said, this was my destiny. I know I am better than all of this. She could literally see where her narrative was. She could see her whole narrative around her. That was basically working at a grocery store, working at a fast food joint, opening the door for people. She knew that that wasn't her identity. She knew that she was smarter than that. But by the time she got into the process, she was in the last rung of folks being chosen and was eliminated at the very last. And then she disappeared, and the whole story was about where'd she go, what happened to her. And it's fascinating, but the upshot of it was, the sad thing about it is that 10 years later or something like that, they finally run into her, and she's not that far, in fact, from the actual reporter who's doing this report. She finds out she just works around the corner. But it just shut her down. She identified so much with the narrative that she'd grown up with that it completely shut her down. And even in spite of people around her trying to tell her this wasn't her narrative, she still was prey to her own story, and it shut her down. And even after talking through this process, could not see beyond that, and she worked at a grocery store as a checkout clerk. But then when they talked to some of the other teachers, it was really sad. This was the troubling part. Out of all of the students that do succeed and move to that program, and I forget what they call the program, but when they move to that program into the private school and then into college, only about 5% or so of those students actually graduate. Eventually, they drop out. When that Oklahoma University frat students, the two students were expelled for the racial statements they were making, and everyone was in an uproar about how horrible that is. And yes, they should be expelled for that kind of stuff. That we don't believe in that. The reality is that even though we don't believe in that, we don't take a really hard enough look at the fact that racism is still hugely prominent in our world, in our culture. There are narratives that are so ingrained in our realities that it's going to take a lot more than a few acts of Congress and a lot more than a few funds tossed this way or that way to change the reality of people. All you have to do is to think of your own spiraling cycle of dysfunctional realities that we've all had to deal with at times, and how challenging it is to get out of those stupid, negative, spiraling realities that we grew up with. Think if the whole culture was prey to that narrative, how much harder. We have folks around us, at least, that will say, doesn't have to be your story. We have role models around us, for many of us, that say, this clearly doesn't have to be your story. To bring hope in the world means that sometimes we have to be willing to reframe the narrative. And sometimes we have to be downright prophetic about it. Sometimes we have to be the ones that are willing to step into the scene and say, you know what, this is not right. There's a different narrative to be heard here. So a couple of things then. The first thing is this. Reframing the narrative is sometimes easy enough to do, and then sometimes for us it's very difficult. Sometimes the role is, where can I do this for others? Sometimes it's, where can I do it for myself? So someone comes up to me and says, I have a real challenge here because I have a friend who's going through this, and I can't see any way around it. And I think, how can you, like Bertolini's character, reframe that narrative a little bit? A friend of mine who's a comic has told me that when his mother-in-law went through Alzheimer's, his wife was so impatient. Well, my sister and my mother have the same kind of relationship, although she's just entering early senility. So my sister, in the middle of this reality, deals with this narrative, which is this constant reality they've had most of their life. But that's not my story. I step into it and reframe that right there. Rather than entering into that relationship in that dynamic, I change it up. I improvise. My friend who's the comic says that every time his mother with Alzheimer's, his mother-in-law with Alzheimer's starts to talk to him and she's in some other reality, he simply goes with that reality. While his wife is sitting there saying how challenging this is and how wrong this is and how difficult this is and how broken this is. He simply says, it's not broken, it's just an opportunity to do something else. Maybe reframing begins with our willingness to stop thinking of things as broken, as needing fixing, and just be willing to change the narrative, to reframe it, to participate in a different way. And then the second thing is, maybe like Anne Frank, the challenge is for us to simply start believing. In the Al-Anon group, they have this great phrase called, fake it till you make it. Maybe there's a time for us to simply, as if, just live as if, and see if we don't start changing the space around us from moment to moment.